November 1996, pre-flight preparation of the Flying Laboratory Tu-144L. Flight experiments will be carried out on it together with American partners. The Flying Laboratory will help to collect scientific and experimental material for the creation of the Project S PS-2 supersonic passenger aircraft of the second generation. Tu-144 on executive start. The engines are put into afterburner mode and the huge bird begins to take off. Easily and gracefully she lifts herself from the ground and leaves the infinite.
A unique achievement of science and the human mind of design thought. Definitely the aircraft of the future.
The early 60s was an era of rapid development of civil aviation all over the world. Airlines are finding it increasingly difficult to service increasing passenger traffic, especially across the Atlantic Ocean. The productivity of air transportation can be raised in two ways: by increasing the speed of aircraft, and therefore their turnover, or by increasing the capacity of aircraft. The creation of wide-body, multi-seat aircraft was hindered by fears of a psychological plan because of the possible large number of victims in the event of an air crash. But supersonic airliners are attractive both for passengers with less flight time and for airlines. This aircraft will do more. Western aviation publications actively discuss the problems of creating future airliners. General designer Andrei Nikolaevich Tupolev closely followed publications abroad.
That's when the data was already available. That's when Andrei Nikolaevich turned to him. He's afraid and says he's already working abroad. We're already working in this direction too. We already have some hints. The government has always said, okay. New regulations are being implemented.
The capabilities of a supersonic passenger plane are impressive. The territory of the Soviet Union is huge. It includes 11 time zones to fly from Moscow to the Far East. Jet Tu-104 made 2 intermediate landings. On a turboprop Tu-114 flight lasted 09.0 on a supersonic airliner, it will be reduced to 3.5 hours. The Far East is getting closer.
And it was crucial that Andrei Nikolaevich immediately said that this is not the development of a new aircraft. This is the rise of the entire science of engineering, equipment technology, metal science systems, another level.
Western aircraft designers were the first to start designing supersonic, that is, supersonic airliners. Creating such an aircraft is such a complex task that Britain and France have pooled their scientific and financial resources. On November 29, 1962, an intergovernmental agreement was signed between representatives of the two countries. Thus came Concorde, a word common to 2 languages and meaning agreement. The plane was supposed to carry 100 passengers at a speed of 2,000 km/h for a range of 6,500 kilometers. The United States also joined the supersonic race. The Americans wanted to make a supersonic passenger liner that would carry 300 passengers at a speed of 3,000 km/h. The task is extremely ambitious. Khrushchev did not want to give the initiative to the capitalists. In July 1963, a resolution was issued by the Central Committee of the CPSU and the Council of Ministers on the creation of a supersonic passenger aircraft, Tu-144 under Tupolev. The plane was supposed to carry 100 passengers at a speed of up to 2,700 kilometers per hour at a distance of 4,500 kilometers. Subsequently, the range was planned to increase to 6,500. Andrei Tupolev named his son Alexei as the project's chief designer. Tupolev Jr. was born at the age of 25 from a young age. He worked in his father's office. At the age of 32, Alexei Andreevich became the head of the Department for Supersonic Unmanned Aerial Vehicles. the team of Tupolev Jr. created a supersonic reconnaissance aircraft Hawk. The problems that young Tupolev solved are similar to those of the future Tu-144.
The car, by the way, passed the test and was launched into a series according to different data. 52, 54 cars were built. They were in service. There were launches. There was operation. It was quite extensive.
The young team under the leadership of Alexei Tupolev enthusiastically got to work. The number of technical problems that need to be solved in a short time is huge.
Begins designing and starting to consider the problem. In general, only the car dynamics head Cheryomikin were stupid. Of course, they understood the complexity of the problems very well.
We're not the composers mostly. Viewed a huge number.
Plane diagrams and...
There, the duck was also a package of engines. So engines means, and such a wing, such an arrow with such an arrow of arrowhead on the other.
As if Tupolev had extensive experience in creating jet bombers. By this time, the supersonic Tu-22 was already mass-produced, but the passenger car was designed almost from scratch. After all, the bomber alone is supersonic for a short time, sufficient to overcome the enemy's PVO zone. The Tu-144 was supposed to fly at supersonic speed. Most of the time, the creators of the new aircraft solved completely new problems. One of them is the choice of aircraft scheme.
Well, tailless, actually. What was the idea? To minimize the plane, that is, to achieve minimum weights?
Tailless aerodynamic scheme that lacks a horizontal tail lid. Instead, 11 controls installed on the trailing edge of the wing are used. Soviet aircraft designers did not have the experience of creating a jet aircraft. Such an aerodynamic scheme, T-SAGI scientists conducted numerous studies and experiments in wind tunnels, blew hundreds of models.
In my opinion, the Tu-144 has no analogues in the history of domestic aircraft construction for its improvement. Huge efforts were expended in his search. The funds are very talented. People worked with this machine, and in general, they achieved very serious success, which can even be later. Never happened again.
One of the key decisions for the future aircraft is the choice of power plant.
Sorry, but we had, of course, a problem because the engine is economic, such as, for example, we didn't have access to foreign options.
Tupolev chose an engine developed under the leadership of Nikolai Kuznetsov at the Kuibyshev motor plant.
For the first stage of testing for Andrei Nikolaevich, the most important requirement for the engine was that the engine worked reliably and would allow the aircraft to be taken out and tested in all modes.
However, Kuznetsov's engine had a significant drawback to allow the Tu-144 to fly at supersonic speeds. These engines had to constantly work in extreme mode on afterburner. In this mode, fuel consumption is too high, the range will be small, but the main thing is to quickly race the car into the sky and overtake the West. Another serious problem is aerodynamic heating at a speed of 2,500 kilometers per hour. The surface of the airliner heats up to 130 degrees. How to make the passenger feel comfortable inside this oven? A special air conditioning system was created. She was tested on a heat wall. These heat release simulators with round metal heads replaced passengers so far. Several dozen standards were created to test a wide variety of systems. Tu-144 conducted hundreds of experiments on them. Tupolev residents have not yet had so much preliminary research, one of the stages of designing a future machine. Construction of a life-size model of an aircraft. Modeling helps to optimally place the equipment, arrange the cabin and passenger cabin.
In this cabin, for many hours and times, we visited, sat and worked here.
1965 International Air Show at Le Bourget. Among experts, the main topic of discussion is the future of civil aviation. It is seen behind supersonic airliners. On the stands of the model of supersonic here is the European Concorde. On the layout of the nose of the aircraft demonstrate the process of lowering the fairing. This provides a good view during takeoff and landing of the American stand. This Boehner aircraft model will have a wing with variable sweep. In the Soviet pavilion for the first time presented model Tu-144. At this time it is only 4 kilometers from the Kremlin. Airliner is born in Metal 1. An experimental machine was assembled in the workshops of the Moscow machine building plant. Experience was the name of Tupolev's firm at that time. The aircraft was built in broad cooperation. 1,000 enterprises across the country were involved in the work in Kuibyshev, made rudders, direction Eliona. The main landing gear in Voronezh made the detachable part of the wing, and the front landing gear for transportation to Moscow of large structures involved helicopter crane Mi-10. The main part of the fuselage and keel were manufactured in the branch of the factories near Moscow Tamil. Then they were transported to Moscow, where the assembly of parts of the aircraft took place. Here the docking of the tail part, and the fuselage clearly read the numbers 60801 is the side number 1 of the experimental machine. At the beginning of '68, the plane was delivered to Zhukovsky. Transportation of such a large cargo was a difficult task. 144 with jewelry precision carried between factory buildings. Final assembly took place on the territory of Zhukovskaya years at the testing and finishing base. These shots of the upper part of the fuselage show open hatches through which the crew should be rescued. In the event of an emergency, only 1 to 144 were equipped with ejection seats, but the mechanism of lowering and raising the nose fairing is being worked out. When the fairing is elevated, the aircraft encounters minimal aerodynamic drag. The work of the train around the clock according to a 3-shift schedule was tight. High-ranking officials regularly visit Jurovka. Alexei Andreevich explaining something to the Minister of Aviation Industry Dementiev and Civil Aviation Loginov. The crew consisted of Commander Eduard Elian, pilot Mikhail Kozlov, lead engineer Vladimir Benderov, and flight engineer Yuri Selivorstov. Preliminary test pilots made flights on the experimental machine made on the basis of the MiG-21 fighter. This unique aircraft is built according to the Bezos scheme. On it was installed a wing in shape, close to the wing of the Tu-144. Hence, the name Analog to Analog studied the flight characteristics and features of piloting the aircraft without germ. And now, finally, came the long-awaited day of escapades from the hangar. Everything is prepared with one pallet. However, the airport is shrouded in fog.
Well, for almost 2 weeks, we rolled it out every morning to the airport, and every morning we returned from it. It was just such a tedious job. You prepare it, you roll it out, you wait. Will you roll it? You'll get some sleep and cook again. The boat has prepared. Well, it was terribly simple.
On December 31st, '68, fortunately, the weather improved somewhat. 13:25, the controllers gave the go-ahead for takeoff.
The flight lasted 38 minutes. I must say that the plane introduced itself in the air perfectly, simply perfectly.
The flight of the supersonic passenger liner Tu-144 was a significant triumph for Soviet science and technology, a major contribution to the development of domestic aircraft industry.
In the West, news about the first flight of the Tu-144 caused a wide resonance in the race of supersonics. The Soviet Tupolev bypassed Concorde. The French liner will take off 2 months later. All the success of the Soviets is attributed to industrial espionage. But even now, little is known about the fact of cooperation between the Soviet Union, France, and England.
In 1965,
At the 27th Salon de Bourget, our model of the Tu-144 aircraft premiered, showcasing materials from Aero Company. It bridged AES Vayaz over Concorde. At this event, key aviation figures like Tupolev Tu-144, the aviation minister, André Ziegler from the French company, and chief designer Pierre Sator concluded it was beneficial to form a working group. In the aviation sector, they proposed creating a subgroup focused on the operational integration of supersonic aircraft.
It is not enough to design and build an airplane. You need to prove that it is safe and reliable. All over the world. For this, there is a procedure for obtaining an airworthiness certificate, since the Tu-144 was planned to be exported. Abroad, it became necessary to introduce similar certification in our country. But here, serious problems arose. The standards of airworthiness abroad were publicly available, and on their basis it was possible to create domestic ones.
The rules are all published.
These methods were documented, but the challenge remained: how to demonstrate that the aircraft met standards. All methods were classified. Extensive discussions with the French aided us in promptly developing our techniques.
The certification process for domestic civil aviation aircraft started with the supersonic Tu-144. On May 26, 1969, a press conference was held at Sheremetyevo Airport with the participation of Tupolev's father and son. Newspapers reported that about 20 foreign airlines have already expressed interest in purchasing the Tu-144. Experimental aircraft tests were progressing steadily. 6 months after its first flight, the aircraft broke the sound barrier and achieved cruising supersonic speed within another 6 months. June 71st, Tu-144 arrived in Le Bourg. It was named the star of the 29 Aerospace Salon. One of his first visits to the exhibitions was by French President Georges Pompidou aboard a Soviet Supersonic. Almost simultaneously with the construction of the experimental machine, 2 copies of the Tu-144 were created. Here they are in the same hangar next door. This aircraft is significantly different from the first at the request of Aeroflot. The number of passengers increased by almost a third. This led to significant changes in design. The fuselage was lengthened by almost 6 meters as the weight of the aircraft increased. Increased the wing area, changed its shape, and this improved the aerodynamic quality of the lighter. The engines were split in pairs to reduce the impact of the hot jets on the tail of the plane. The front rack of the landing gear was moved forward. The main landing gear began to move not into the wing, as on the experimental aircraft, but into the compartment between the air intakes. To enhance takeoff and landing capabilities, front wings were installed on the forward section of the fuselage. This innovative solution is unique in its design, which we can elucidate due to the specialized slit arrangement. The front wing produces lift across a broad spectrum of attack angles, and upon deployment, there is a converging moment as the angle of attack rises. To counteract this, the 11s on the main wing are lowered. By lowering, they change the curvature of the wing profile and thereby increase lift. This improves the takeoff and landing characteristics of the Tu-144 and reduces the requirements for the aerodrome. At the Voronezh aviation plant, the development of the aircraft of the future was in full swing. Manufacturers faced a huge number of problems. Take at least the manufacture of large wing panels and a length of 9 meters. Nothing like this in the Soviet Union before was not produced. The plant was visited by a delegation of French aviation specialists headed by the president of Aerospol, Henri Ziegler. They were accompanied by Alexei Tupolev. Guests watched with interest the processes of release and cleaning of the chassis. Its complex kinematics are unique. In its own way, the trolley is compact so that it can be placed in a narrow compartment. Finally, on March 29, 721 serial Tu-144 took to the air with its side number 77102. Tu-144 is 65.7 meters long, 12.5 meters high, with a wingspan of 28 meter. It has a maximum takeoff weight of 195 tons. Maximum speed 2,500 km/h. Flight range is 30-80 km with a practical ceiling of 18,750 m, crew of 4, and can carry 150 passengers. The aircraft was transferred to Concordski airfield for further testing of the Tu-144. In the focus of attention of journalists, no one guessed about the tragic fate of this aircraft on June 3, 1973, during a demonstration flight at the next aerospace show in Le Bourget. The Tu-144 crashed. The last day of the exhibition, Soviet Supersonic effectively performed the demonstration program. At the end, he made another pass through the field and made an energetic cut. As he exited it, just below the edge of the clouds, he lowered his nose abruptly and headed for the ground. At the moment of withdrawal from the peak, the plane from overload fell apart. Killed 6 crew members and 7 residents of the town of Goussainville-Coutau Field about the pubic area. An investigation was ordered. According to the official version, the reason for the sharp maneuver was the evasion of the Mirage aircraft, which was photographing the Tu-144 and could interfere with our aircraft. However, in the early 1990s, new facts emerged.
The pilots performed an unplanned mode during the flight task of this mode was not.
Why did the crew risk changing the mission? The fact is that the day before Concorde demonstrated a spectacular maneuver at the end of its flight program, after landing and stopping, he took off again with a sharp increase in altitude.
Well, I was decided to show the maneuverable Hori, the characteristics of the aircraft. Well, what happened was that they turned on, which means the untested mode, and the plane in general suffered as a result of the disaster. The car had such blocks that were supplied with a test set for the first time. They have not yet been tested in the air, they should not have been turned on, and the plant in Voronezh did not turn them off in time. Well, they didn't turn it off at all. They just put it on, they didn't turn it off. Or our pilots. I don't know if these units are connected. They included them in flight. They included a system to improve maneuverability characteristics, to increase the efficiency of the rudders. They thought that there would simply be an increase in rudders, but it turned out to be uncalculated. And so what? Back then, it wasn't difficult to combat this.
73 years became fatal for the fate of the world's supersonic civil aviation. The Americans abandoned their grand plan. The plane turned out to be too expensive, but Boeing came on stage. The 747 is nothing that flies on subsound, but takes almost 500 passengers. At the Le Bourget Air Show, Airbus presented its firstborn wide-body A300. With this premiere, the global competition of 2 modern giants of aircraft industry began. Meanwhile, the U.S. government banned Concorde flights over its territory. The reason for numerous lawsuits in courts with complaints about the effects of sound strikes. The Arab-Israeli conflict began in autumn, causing oil prices to skyrocket. Operating supersonic aircraft, which consumed vast amounts of fuel, became economically unfeasible for airlines. Mass supersonic transportation was put an end to. USSR Minister of Civil Aviation Boris Bugayev. Also, he was a preference for a roomy subsonic aircraft in OK. Ilyushin begins the design of the wide-body Airbus Il-86, but there is a decision of the 24th Congress to PSC, where it is separately stated that by 75-year Tu-144 should go to the routes of Aeroflot. Bugayev realized that the Tu-144 would always be a significant problem for him.
Firstly, you need to consider the economy, what the cost of transportation on this plane will cost, what it will cost from the point of view of transportation safety, which was already large then. At the end of the year, there was not enough kerosene. I believe so. They wouldn't pull it anymore.
Meanwhile, tests of the Tu-144 continued for a full year. The main thing for a passenger car is its reliability. Here are tests to protect the engine from water ingress during takeoff. For this purpose, a special pool is made on the strip. The plane operates at varying speeds. And on these frames, the methods of evacuation of Tu-144 during an emergency landing without landing gear are practiced. Special pneumatic lifts are used for this purpose. They are inflatable swamps. They put them under the plane. Then they pump in air. The plane is rising. A special trailer is provided, and the tractors are evacuating the car.
They spent a considerable amount of time working on it. We didn't leave the airfield 2 at 15:04, and all this was done as quickly as possible. That is 2 and 3 shifts, in fact. Many did not leave.
Finally, Tu-144 received 1 in the Soviet Union Certificate of Airworthiness, were assigned regular passenger services to Alma-Ata for flights over longer distances. The car lacked range. The flight was scheduled for November 1st, 77. On the anniversary of the October Revolution, the liner arrived. Minister Bugaev reported to Ship Commander Boris Kuznetsov. Ship Commander Kuznetsov is ready. At 09:03 was made 1 takeoff with passengers. Foreign journalists were invited to cover the flight. In these footage of the Chronicle, you can see the correspondent of the German magazine Spiegel, Norbert Akuhinka, who in 2 years will become known to the entire Soviet Union as the performer of the role of Danish Professor Bill Hansen from the film Autumn Marathon Andrew. Okay with that? Exactly after Tu-144 landed in Alma-Ata. Solemn meeting, flowers, journalists, a small rally.
I instructed, take the tickets. It's like being at the Dasha. I instruct you to travel for 2 hours and you'll be in Moscow.
At 15:31, Tu-144 returned back to Domodedovo. The aircraft was placed on the schedule of regular flights. It flew once a week, and the ticket cost 68 rubles versus 48 for a regular plane.
They served caviar and cognac on board. In general, exquisite dishes were offered, or so the guides informed us. I don't know. I didn't try it because we didn't have time there. There wasn't time here until you took off, until you didn't have time to turn around here. You already need to descend. What kind of food there?
The plane flew like a projectile fired from it from one city. It flies, and exactly according to a certain program. This was the most economical mode, which therefore allowed us to have a sufficient reserve of fuel to leave. Aerodrome, all this was calculated. All flight safety issues were provided.
And flew?
But still, the Tu-144 was built for long-distance flights. It was supposed to fly to Khabarovsk, but the whole problem is the veracity of Kuznetsov's engines. Every second, they burned 11 kilos of fuel per hour, totaling almost 40 tons. Tupolev from the very beginning understood the need to create an economical engine without afterburner. It was commissioned to develop the team of chief designer Peter Kolosov in Rybinsk. There was experience in creating engines for supersonic bombers. But the work was very slow, and I constantly faced problems.
We were there in practice just to study the operation of these Kolosov engines and when. The director of the wheel factory asks, well, our engines need to do this 144 faster. He told him that we would have it now. The Olympics. And it is more important for us to provide engines for 62 aircraft. and therefore they were left with a small site such as the one on which they assembled these engines. So, in general, quickly there. And it was absolutely impossible to fully prepare the engine qualitatively.
Despite all the challenges, the initial prototypes of the new engines were completed by the spring of '78. This allowed the commencement of state tests of the long-range Tu-144D aircraft equipped with Kolesov engines. These tests proved to be successful. The only remaining task was to complete the final flight and assess the functionality of the auxiliary power plant, known as VSL mid-air. This particular unit provides the aircraft with electrical power during engine shutdowns.
On restart in CU, a fire started.
A fire started on the engines on the right side. I drove, which means smoke.
I gave the command for my side to park the vehicle, and the landing was successfully executed.
Where, yes, at a speed of about 400 km/h, there was a soft landing, but then
very heavy overloads began.
The plane was partially destroyed and burned, killing 2 members of the type.
I must say that the management system was self-confident until the very beginning. Landing. If what is practically already. Little shot overworked.
We found the reason. It resulted in death, and there was nothing more to it. The vibration tore off the welded appendix on the fuel line, which had the sensor on it and was filled with fuel from all. And when they launched the hoist, it tanned, there was a fire.
This tragedy had nothing to do with aircraft with Kuznetsov engines flying on the Moscow-Almaty route. However, passenger flights were closed. As a result, in 7 months, Aeroflot made only 55 flights and transported 394 passengers. Despite the disaster, the Tupolev were determined to get the airliner back on the passenger routes. Tests and refinements continued on June 23, 79, year Tu-144D. First flew to Khabarovsk long-distance flight was successful, but failures seemed to haunt the car. 31st of July 80. In one of the flights at an altitude of 17 kilometers, the turbine disc of the aircraft collapsed. Due to the crew's skill, they rescued the car and landed it in Engels at a military airfield.
They opened the third engine. As soon as they opened it, blades and tubes fell from it, which is not from there. It didn't seem to me that half the engine whispered out of there.
6 months later, another engine failed on the test bench in Rybinsk. Again, improvements were needed. Meanwhile, on Aeroflot lines, there was a successful introduction of Airbus IL-86. It was manufactured at the same Voronezh aircraft plant. The country's leadership has changed its attitude towards the supersonic airliner. At the beginning of July 83rd, a government decree was issued to stop all work. Aeroflot's reluctance to put into operation Tu-144 put an end to its passenger career. A huge amount of money was spent on the creation of the airliner. It is impossible to even name the exact amount. Was the money thrown to the wind?
Well, the fact that this is, of course, the fall of a big say forward, because the head, recently a lot of new technologies, including titanium.
Scientists, designers gained knowledge and experience, thanks to which it became possible to create a supersonic bomber Tu-160. Basics of Russian strategic aviation.
She's about 5 feet 2 inches tall. With a total of 6 large panels, 2 were utilized for creating strong, durable, large-sized milled ones. This facilitated the development of more advanced machinery. Better.
The last aircraft to be released was transferred to the Research Institute, with the machine bearing the tail number 77115 operating under the Buran space program.
So the defendant's flight crew worked here. This is for the purpose of understanding how to perform flights and, above all, landings.
They were doing a simulated landing. They planned the plane with the engines fired from a height of 5,000 meters and somewhere up to 700 meters, then turned on the increased engine mode and in general landed.
A total of 16 aircraft were produced. Currently, 7 of them are in storage or museums, with one of them in Germany, at the Museum of Technology in Ginsheim. Here he is on the pedestal, and next to him stands Concorde. 2 cars were lost in plane crashes and 7 were dismantled for metal. This car was also expected to be destroyed. In 2006, Alexei Omalushkin, who worked for 144 for more than 30 years, saw how workers began to cut off titanium engine hoods, and the barbaric cutting on metal pride of Soviet aircraft managed to report to the governor of the Moscow region. Instructions followed to buy the car from scrap metal collectors. This case caused a wide public resonance, stirred up the press and television. A press conference was organized where Eduard Elyan and Yuri Seliverstov met again. Members of the crew of the Tu-144, which made one flight in the distant 68 years. The plane was painted in Stilling order, and now it is decorated with max air shows.
If we don't keep this plane, then I don't know. We probably won't be worth anything, because this is our history. I have heard an interesting expression that a nation dies when its history dies. She shouldn't die here, and we should all somehow contribute to preserve this plane.